Before we get started, I want to take a quick look at who this course is for. So, this course is based on this book. And when I wrote this book, I said that I had several audiences in mind when I wrote it. So, one audience is those who want a simple introduction to functional programming in Scala. A second audience is developers who want to get started using the Zio and Cats effect libraries. A third audience is those who are interested in writing better code. And I'll take a look at what I mean by better code in just a few minutes. Parallel and concurrent application developers is another audience I had in mind, big data application developers. The sixth point I make is that this book might be more for upper class college students than it would be for freshmen and sophomore, but please bear in mind I haven't been in college in a long time. So let's take a little look at why I make those statements. The first one here is developers who want a simple introduction to functional programming. So I wrote this book because I was just learning functional programming myself at the time. So I kept a lot of notes as I was going through that learning process. And back during the time when I wrote this first edition of this book, it was 2015 through 2017. There weren't any really great learning resources out there. So I just kept all these notes, and then all of those notes became this book, especially once I got to the end and I realized what I was doing. Then I was able to come back and reorder those notes and put an emphasis on what was important, and of course, less emphasis on the things that weren't that important. A second category of developers who this book is for is those that want to get started with the Zio and the Cats Effect libraries. So I note here that I wrote a book. I changed the name of this book, so now it's called Learn Functional Programming the Fast Way instead of Without Fear. So it's Learn Functional Programming the Fast Way. Also, the PDF version of this book is now free. I do want to state that. But that's the little FB book. I wrote that one. It's about 250 pages long, and it's for Java, Kotlin, OOP developers who wanted a fast path to get started working with Zio and Cats Effect. So at the end of that book, I do start showing some Zio examples. So I can turn you over to the Zio documentation in that book, and you can actually start running the first Zio examples. Now, conversely, the book that you're looking at right now, the print version is 3 times larger than that book, and the PDF is 4 times larger than that book. So this book, and therefore this course, gets into much more detail than this book and this video course here. So we're going to get into more detail here. So even though in the previous video course, which is based on this other book, I did get you already ready for the Zio library. Now, by the time you finish this course, I'm going to get into a lot more details that I didn't cover in this smaller book. So you'll be even more and more ready to start working with Zio at the end of this course. Now, next line here, or the next category, those interested in writing better code. I wasn't trying to create any sort of controversy here or anything like that when I said that. What I want to do is just kind of focus on some best practices. So I talk about writing pure functions, which are a good thing. In Scala, I talk about using val fields instead of var. So even in OOP, you want to use val as much as possible and then use var only when you really, really have to. And in functional programming, we use val all the time. And the third note I make here is avoiding the use of null values. I think everyone agrees now that we want to do something to get around the use of null values. So those are some of the things I emphasize in this book. So again, I'm not trying to create any sort of controversy. What I am trying to focus on is I define better as meaning safer, easier to test, and more error-free. So within this course, that's what I'm going to try to show is how to write code that is safer, easier to test, and more error-free. And a lot of that has to do with the use of immutable variables, immutable data structures, and pure functions. And as I mentioned in the previous course, one of the problems you run into in object-oriented programming is you might be working on a function, and let's say that function happens to be right here. So you're just worried about 5 or 10 lines in your code, if you can imagine that right here. So when you're writing a pure function, you're just worried about this little universe right here, if you just imagine that code being right there. And in object-oriented programming, what happens is you have some kind of mutable state that is elsewhere in the code. So if you're working in a function here, you may be modifying some mutable data structure or even a mutable value in this function here that's affecting things outside of your function. So it's affecting things over here and over here and over here and so on. So in pure functional programming, what we do is when you're writing code right here, that's the only thing you're affecting is this code right here. And so that's part of what I mean by safer and easier to test and more error-free, because we're only thinking about this little area. Again, if this was a pure function, that's the only thing we're thinking about when we're writing pure functions. And then here I've had this ongoing theme in my programming life is I always want to be able to write applications faster, but without sacrificing quality and maintainability. So that's another point that I'll make in here. And again, I put an emphasis on pure functions right there. And we'll talk about all this more as we go through this course. The parallel and concurrent developers, I don't have much in here on this theme right now, other than to say that as I was rewriting this book in early 2023, I believe it was fairly commonly known at least in the Scala world, that Zio and Cat's Effect were two really terrific functional programming libraries for developing parallel and concurrent applications. So there's websites and web applications like Caesars and Disney that are built on these two libraries. And those are some of the busiest websites in the world, and they take advantage of the parallel and concurrent features inside of Zio and Cat's Effect to get that work done. So I'll talk about this more as we go along. One point I make here is that even if everyone could somehow use quantum computers today or tomorrow, performance might not be an issue, but we still would probably want to do some things in parallel. And when you want to do that, Zio and Cat's Effect make that type of code much easier to work with. And currently, that's in my opinion, and I hope to show that more as we go out through this course. Big data application developers is another group that I think this book and this video course might be helpful for. And when I'm talking about this, I'm thinking of Apache Spark in my mind because I did some work back in the day processing Apache access log records with Spark. And the code I wrote then was really a lot like algebra because when you're working with Spark, you're working with huge data sets. You're running some kind of equations or expressions on those, and you're doing this work as a series of steps, really. So you're saying, do this, do this, do that. And then at the end, you end up with some type of result. So what I found during that time was that the code I was writing was naturally a lot like algebra, and my code had no dependence on side effects because you just kind of keep assuming that things are working or that your equations are working. And you might use option values or try or either during that process. And that's pretty much what we do in functional programming. So again, we'll talk about this more when we get into it. Another thing I noted when I wrote the first edition of the Scala cookbook, I noted that because I thought it was kind of a power user language, I didn't think it would be a good language for students to learn as their first programming language. However, I thought it'd be a great language for them to learn once they had seen another language like Java or C or something like that. And I should say that part of that was based on my misunderstanding of how to use some things in Scala, and especially best practices. So if I had known more about those best practices, I might not have made that statement. But here what I'll say is I think that Scala is 100%, it's going to be an awesome language for college students that already have experience with other languages, and it's a terrific first functional programming language to learn. And I hope you'll see that as we go along here. And finally, if you look at a list of the people who I have written this book for, then I don't think it'll be a huge surprise that this book is not written for functional programming experts or theorists. I don't offer any new theory in this video course. What I do try to do is I try to explain functional programming using Scala in the simplest way I can.